Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming, or OOP, allows programmers to create their own objects that have methods and attributes, and it's a really great way, once you begin scaling your code, to organize your code. So recall that after we defined things such as a string, list, dictionary, or other built-in Python objects, we were able to call methods off of them with the .method name syntax, such as when we were able to call the append method off of a list object, or the index method off of a tuple. These methods act as functions that use information about the object, as well as the object itself, to return results, or edit or change the current object somehow, such as when you called .sort on a list, it went ahead and edited the current list. For example, this includes appending to a list or counting the occurrences of an element in a tuple. So those methods use information about the object and then either return a result or they edit and change the current object in some manner. OOP, or Object-Oriented Programming, allows users to create their own objects with their own methods and own attributes. And the general format is often confusing when first encountered, particularly because of the use of a self keyword. And its usefulness may not be completely clear at first for beginners. But in general, object-oriented programming allows us to create code that is repeatable and organized, and at a certain scale, you're going to need to understand how to work with object-oriented programming in order to make sure your programs themselves are flexible. And when you're working with outside libraries, you'll see how they make use of object-oriented programming in a lot of their code. So for much larger scripts of Python code, functions by themselves really aren't going to be enough for organization and repeatability. Commonly repeated tasks and objects can be defined with OOP to create code that is more usable, especially across an organization. So let's check out the syntax of object-oriented programming, and don't worry about completely understanding everything we show you right now. We're going to take it step by step in a Jupyter Notebook through a series of lectures. But for right now, I just want to give you a brief overview of some special syntax calls that we haven't really seen before. The first one being the class keyword. So the basic way that you define an object is using the class keyword. And that's why sometimes objects are also called classes in Python. Sometimes people like to interchange those two terms. But basically we have the class keyword and then we have the name of the class. And notice here that the name of the class now is following what's called camel casing, where every individual word has that first letter capitalized, which is why we were telling you before to have variable names and function names in lowercase, because classes, those are the reserved uppercase words and uppercase naming schemes. So we have class, and then we define the name of the class. The next thing we notice here is this thing that looks a lot like a function, but it's actually called a method when it's inside of an object or inside of a class call. And here we have def, just like we would with a function, and we have this special method called init method, and it's underscore underscore init, and this allows you to create an instance of the actual object. You'll notice here we have then a self keyword as well as some parameters to be passed. So param1 and param2 are going to be parameters that Python expects you to pass when you actually create an instance of this object. And then what it does is when you pass in a parameter, for instance parameter2, you go ahead and assign it to an attribute of the function. That way Python knows that when you're referring to self.param2, you're referring to the attribute param2 that's connected to this actual instance of the class instead of a global variable called param2. And we'll explain this in a lot more detail because this is a step that is really confusing at first. But again, all we're doing here is we're going to pass in a parameter and then connect that parameter with the use of that self.argument or self.parameter to link it to the actual object itself. After that, then we can have various other method calls. And these look a lot like functions. We say def, the name of whatever you want your method to be, and then you pass in that self keyword again to let Python know that this isn't just some function, it's a method that's connected to this class. And that's why we use the self word, to connect these methods to the class so that when you call something like self.param1, it knows that you're referring to the attribute param1 that's connected to the class itself. Okay, so we're going to explore object-oriented programming in a lot more detail, take it really slowly step by step in the next series of lectures. So if that was all kind of a real quick blur for you, don't worry, we're going to go step by step coming up next. We'll see you there.